Today's sermon comes from Matthew chapter 16, verses 13 through 20. We're going to have to break this into two parts, guys. So the first part is called On This Rock, a New People. Let's read the text and then we'll start to exposit it. Verse 13, Now when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, Who do people say that the Son of Man is? And they said, Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. And he said to them, But who do you say that I am? So Simon Peter replied, You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus answered him, Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. And then he strictly charged the disciples to tell no one that he was the Christ. There is a ton of stuff in this particular passage, and this particular passage is very charged in some congregations, and we'll look at some of the reason for what makes this section so unique and why it's so charged. But let's just start out with something simple. Let's observe that he says that Jesus took them to the district of Caesarea Philippi. Caesarea Philippi is what you see pictured before you there. There is a ton of information that goes into this location. It's fascinating. It might be interesting to do some research. I'll just touch on it very briefly because I don't think that this is where we want to focus all of our time. Caesarea Philippi is going to be 25 miles north of Galilee. North of Galilee, and it's within just a few miles of the furthest point of the tribal lands that God promised to Israel. He's almost at the furthest northest boundary of the lands that were promised to Israel. This particular cave, this grotto, is famous for its paganism, its heathenism, and it's called the Cave of Pan. Pan was one of the deities that they worshipped. And just a little note, a little side note, this area is only a few miles, 5 or 6 miles away from the place where Jeroboam went up north and built high places for those 10 tribes to worship Israel. Sorry. Yeah, I got 4 things going on in my mind. Okay, let's try it again. This is only a few miles from the area where Jeroboam took those northern 10 tribes and built high places and altars in the north for them to worship the Baals, the cows that they had made, the images that they had made, so that they would not go down to Jerusalem. This is in the same area as that. Let me give you a couple quotes here about this area. Jesus' disciples must have been shocked. Caesarea Philippi was infamous for its ritual sex, and the Jews would have avoided any exposure to the debauched, erotic spectacles put on there. It was a city of people who were eagerly knocking on the doors of hell. It's the most pagan, it's the most heathen place that God has taken Jesus has taken his disciples so far. It's the most Gentile, most vile place. Another quote here, in the pagan mindset, that limestone cave at Caesarea Philippi was literally a gate to the underworld, where fertility gods would go to spend the winter. Here at the shrine precinct, facing a series of marble temples and niches for pagan idols, worshippers engaged in ritual prostitution and bestiality with goats in the belief that those sexual relations would entice and return the return of Pan in the spring. In our Wednesday night courses, we're studying the prophets, and what is being done during the time of Jesus at this location is the same thing that was being done way back when Hosea and the other prophets were saying, you need to turn from your wickedness, you need to turn from these gods that you're worshiping, and that's exactly what they would do. The gods were thought to be seasonal, so one god would die, and because he would die, there would be a drought, is what they thought. And in order to bring the spring rains, they would have to engage in these immoral behaviors in order to bring that god back out and to bring the rain. And that's exactly what they were doing. And this is the place that was known for exactly that. Also of interest to us is there is a spring, there is a lake that starts inside the cave, and it flows out of the cave, and it's believed that that is the headwaters, the source for the Jordan River. So there is a lot going on there, but I just wanted to touch on some of that background for you. For whatever reason, Jesus has his disciples travel 25 miles north of Galilee to go to this particular place, and this is where he chooses to ask his disciples the question, who do people say that I am? Who do people say that I am? And they answered him and they said, well, different people say different things. Some people say John the Baptist. Some people say Elijah. Some people say the prophet Jeremiah. And some people say one of the other prophets. Now, I think it's of interest to us to notice something. The people didn't mind ascribing or putting Jesus into the category of prophet. But they didn't see, much like people today. People today have no problem saying Jesus was a prophet, Jesus was a good guy, Jesus was a teacher. They want to put him in that category, but notice none of the people recognized Jesus as the Messiah. The Messiah was something completely different than a prophet. A prophet was a teacher, someone that gave you God's words. But the Messiah, they thought the Messiah would be a political figure that would change everything. Now, let me put a pin in the sermon right here. This is the point. This is the text. This is what triggers Jesus asking his disciples. Everybody else puts me in the category of a prophet. Where do you guys put me? And of course, Peter has his famous answer. You are the Messiah. You are the Christ. You are the Son of the living God. Peter is the one that recognizes Jesus for who he really is. So this triggers a response from Jesus, and Jesus' response is going to become one of the most debated texts that we have today. What Jesus replies, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. And so really, the point of our sermon is to focus on verses 18 and 19. That's where we would best spend our time. In case you aren't familiar with this is the text that gets used by the Catholic Church to ascribe papal authority to Peter. This is the text that the Catholic Church says, this is Jesus creating a hierarchical structure, and this is Jesus putting Peter at the pinnacle of the hierarchy of authority, and other people, bishops and cardinals, are all below him. But this is Jesus exalting Peter to the highest point of the structure of the church. At least that's what's been said. They go on to say that this makes Peter the first pope, that this makes Peter infallible, that Peter holds the keys to the kingdom, so whatever he says go, he is the authority, and that's what they ascribe to the pope today. Protestantism, non-Catholic faiths, because of that, want to stay so far away from that idea of Jesus saying that Peter was any kind of special person. The Protestant church has gone so far in the other direction to say this has nothing to do with Peter. This has to do with Jesus. This has to do with faith. This has to do with confession. And they kind of want to take Peter out of the picture altogether because we want to stay far away from the idea that Peter was anything special in the church. And I think both of those make a little mistake. So we're going to look at the terms. We're going to want to define the terms that are used in this text so that we can understand what Jesus did mean and not be afraid of sounding like we're giving Peter too much of an exalted special place, and yet we do need to deal with the text. So let's just deal with verse 18 in this sermon, and then we'll deal with verse 19 next week. So verse 18, and I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. The first thing that is important is the phrase, and I tell you. This is Jesus in his authority saying, I am about to reveal to you a new truth. We should remember a hint, but I say to you. Hopefully, we recognize that's not the first time Jesus has ever taken this position of authority. If we go all the way back to Matthew chapter 5, Matthew chapter 5 was the Beatitudes. And in the Beatitudes, Jesus would say, blessed are you for. Blessed are you when. Blessed are you, and then he would follow it up with something. And then after that, Jesus says, now you have heard this, but I tell you this. You have heard this, but I say this. And so it would be good if we would make an association with chapter 5, because in chapter 5, Jesus takes authority. Jesus pronounces a blessing, and then Jesus says, I've got something to reveal to you. I have got a new reality to reveal to you. And when we look at our text today, he first says, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah. Blessed are you, Simon Peter. So there's the blessing, but then he follows that up, just like chapter 5, by saying, I say to you something new. So we should prepare ourselves that Jesus is about to paint some kind of a new reality which is going to offset the way things used to be prior to this. Let me just remind you, in the Beatitudes, chapter 5 and verse 20, but I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees. Verse 22, but I say to you, everyone who is angry with his brother is liable to judgment. Verse 28, but I say to you, everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery. Jesus has painted brand new realities for the disciples. And so that should put us in the framework that when Jesus tells Peter, but I say to you, that Jesus is going to paint a brand new reality. That's a big hint. So there's two things that we want to watch for in our text today that I think of the biggest value for us. The first one is in verse 18, and the idea is, I am going to make a new people for myself. A new people for myself. That's verse 18. That's what we'll cover today. But verse 19, he says, and I'm going to create new leadership for my people. I am going to impose new authorities for this new group of people that I am going to grow. That'll be verse 19, and that'll be next week. But that's the crux of the text that we're looking at. I say to you, I'm going to make a new people, and I'm going to put new people in charge. Verse 18, and I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. This would be the second thing I would want us to notice. Build my church. And the key word here is church. So we want to define this term. And unfortunately, I believe you should look at your Bibles and see how the word is translated. The word is ecclesia, and you should see how it's translated in your text. Normally, it's translated my church, but I think that that's misleading, and I want to show you what a better interpretation of that word would be. The term ecclesia, ek means out of, kaleo means to call. Ecclesia is two words put together. I'm calling you out of. Calling you out of the world. And when it has a spiritual meaning, it refers to God's people. The word ecclesia is all throughout the Bible. It's all throughout the Old Testament. I want to show you how it's used in the Old Testament and how ecclesia gets translated in the Old Testament, because I believe that is what Jesus is thinking. But for some reason, our English translators have not stayed consistent with how they translated ecclesia in the Old Testament and how they translate the word ecclesia in the New Testament. And I'm still a little bit boggled by it, to be honest. I almost feel like I've got a conspiracy theory that they don't translate the word the same. They use the word church in the New Testament. They use the word the assembly in the Old Testament. But it's the same word, ecclesia. Really, you got to ask yourself, where does the English word church come from? Most people think it comes from the Greek word, but it does not. Ecclesia has something to do with a German word. Ecclesia. Church has something to do with a German word. I don't know why we ever settled on the word church. We're used to it. It's very familiar to us, but I think it's the wrong word. And because of that, it makes us miss what Jesus is saying. So let me show you how your Bibles translate ecclesia in the Old Testament, and then we can all kind of wonder, why did they change it? Let me take you back to Deuteronomy 23 and verse 1. Deuteronomy 23, all these verses that I'm going to take you to in the Old Testament have the word ecclesia. It's always translated the assembly. The assembly means the people of God, the Jewish nation, God's people, the assembly. That's always what it means. So Deuteronomy 23:1, no one whose testicles are crushed or whose male organ is cut off shall enter into the ecclesia, the assembly of the Lord. Deuteronomy 23 and verse 2, no one born of a forbidden union may enter the ecclesia, the assembly of the Lord. Even to the 10th generation, none of his descendants may enter into the ecclesia, the assembly of the Lord. Take you to 1 Kings chapter 8 and verse 55. And he stood and he blessed the ecclesia, the assembly of Israel, with a loud voice, saying. So ecclesia is not a new word for Jesus' people. Ecclesia is an old word for God's people, God's gathering, this group of people that assemble to worship their God, and it's always called this assembly, this congregation, this group of people. And throughout the Old Testament, ecclesia, when it's used in a spiritual sense, it's referring to Israel, it's referring to God's people. So I'm curious, Jesus is painting the same idea of this assembly of people, except Jesus is saying, I'm going to build my assembly of people. I'm going to build my new called out group of people. I am going to create a new ecclesia, a new assembly of people, which means this new assembly of people replaces the old assembly of people. Does that make sense? Jesus will found and create and gather together a new assembly of people that are going to replace the original assembly of people, which was Israel, the Jews, God's people. That's why I think it's very important to understand that the word should be the same, assembly. Otherwise, you miss the connection that this is replacing the old assembly of people. It's very strange to me why the word church gets used all throughout the New Testament, but in the Old Testament, it's always assembly. I think in order to preserve the thought that Jesus is creating here, we need to know that foundational principle right there. Now, we'll take this a little bit deeper, and if we were familiar with how God created the Jewish people, the Jewish nation, what was originally called the ecclesia, if we're familiar with that story, then we will recognize that Jesus uses all of the same types of things that God used when God created His first ecclesia, the Jewish people. And I want to give you those terms so that we make no mistake that Jesus is redoing what God did with Israel, but Jesus is doing it starting with Peter and a new group of people. So let me take you back and show you. God started His people, Israel, His ecclesia, with a person. Do you remember who he was? Abraham. God seems to start building His people with one particular individual. Ground zero. So let's see that first. Genesis chapter 17. When God built His first ecclesia, He came to Abraham, Genesis 17 and verse 6, and says, I will make you fruitful, and I will make you into a nation, and kings will come from you. Now notice, God is taking the credit for this. God is saying, I am going to build a new nation, starting with you, Abraham. Now go back to our text and remember, Jesus is saying, I am going to build a new ecclesia, starting with you, Peter. As we go on, there are these metaphors and there are these ideas of starting out this thing that you're building with some kind of a rock. Back then, today when you start building a house, the first thing you do is pour a foundation. We wouldn't build on rocks now, we pour a cement foundation. But back then, you remember the parable, a wise man will build his house on a rock. A fool builds his house on the sand. And so there is this metaphor, this understanding that when you want to build something that's going to stand the test of time, Scripture usually says it's got to be built on a rock. Well, the Scriptures say that Abraham was the rock that God built His ecclesia on. Let me take you there, Isaiah 51 and verse 1. Listen to me, you who pursue righteousness, you who seek the Lord. Look to the rock from which you were hewn, and to the quarry from which you were dug. Look to Abraham your father, and Sarah who bore you. For he was but one when I called him, that I might bless him and multiply him. I hope you see the connection here. When God starts to build something in antiquities, this concept of starting with a rock just seems to be what the scriptures use for this beginning point, ground zero. You got to start with a rock. And he says clearly here, for example, Abraham and Sarah were the rocks that God started with, and he started with that, and from that, he multiplied and built his ecclesia. I believe that's the language that Jesus is drawing on when he says, I'm about to do something new. I'm about to build something new. I'm going to build it on a rock. And Peter, just like Abraham, you happen to be the rock. You happen to be this beginning point, this ground zero for this new ecclesia that I'm about to build. In the same way that God built his first ecclesia on the rock, who was Abraham and Sarah, Jesus is saying, I'm going to build a new ecclesia, and it's going to start with Peter. Jesus is going to usher in a new people. God designated Abraham and Sarah as his rocks. He determined that he would build a whole nation, a whole people, a whole ecclesia from just this one person. And that's what we see Jesus doing. To keep the story still parallel to Abraham, you remember Abraham wasn't really his name. His name was originally Abram. But when God chooses this rock to build his ecclesia on, he gives this person a brand new name. And he switches his name from Abram to Abraham. Let me take you to that. A brand new name. Genesis 17 and verse 3. Then Abram fell on his face, and God said to him, Behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be the father of a multitude of nations. No longer shall your name be called Abram, but your name shall be Abraham. For I made you the father of a multitude of nations. I will make you exceedingly fruitful. I will make you into nations, and kings will come from you. Well, if our text in Matthew is following the Abraham story, if our text is following, ascribing a new sort of an Abraham for this new ecclesia that God is going to build, then it would make sense that maybe Jesus also gives this new guy a new name. And that's exactly what he does here in verse 18. Originally, his name was Simon. And Jesus says, I'm going to build something new. And I say to you, Simon Bar-Jonah, here's a new name for you. Your new name is Peter. I didn't go into a lot of detail on this idea of the word Peter, but a lot gets made up. A lot of ink has been spilt on the Greek word Petros for Peter and Petra for rock. Petros is a pebble. Petra is a huge stone. This idea of building on these stones. And there's a lot of ink that says, okay, well, is it on Peter, or is it on the Petra, or is it on the Petros, or which one is it? And do you know that argument really doesn't matter, because Jesus spoke Aramaic? So when Jesus said this phrase to Peter, he did not use the word Petros or Petra. Jesus used the word Cephas. Cephas is an Aramaic word for rock. So this whole thing that we've done, is it Petra? Is it Petros? What did he mean? What is Jesus? All of that goes out the door because Jesus spoke Aramaic, and what Jesus said was Cephas. But the translation of the Aramaic word Cephas, which means rock, into the Greek is Petros and Petra, and that's where the confusion happens, but that's not really what Jesus said, so we really don't need to spend too much time on that argument. Let me just remind you of this. John chapter 1 and verse 41, when Andrew first finds his brother Simon Peter, Jesus had already said, I'm going to give you a new name. We didn't realize it, but let's look at it. John 1 and verse 41. Andrew went and he first found his brother Simon and said to him, we have found the Messiah. Mashiach would have been Aramaic. So he has to translate it into Greek, which means Christ in the Greek. He just translated Aramaic into Greek. Verse 42, he brought him to Jesus. Jesus looked at him and said, you are Simon, son of John, but you shall be called Cephas. Cephas is Aramaic for rock. But when you translate it into Greek, it means Peter. So really there's no argument there. And Cephas was the word in both places. I tell you, you are Cephas, and on this Cephas I will build my church. You are rock, and on this rock I will build my church. So the church has wanted to get away from that. We've wanted to, because we're afraid of sounding Catholic. But there's no reason to be afraid of that. That is what Jesus said. So Jesus gives Simon a new name. Let me put a pin in the sermon right there, and I want to let you guys know that Isaiah had already looked forward to the future and saw this day when Jesus is doing exactly what he says he is doing. And it already described it to us. Let me show it to you in Isaiah. Isaiah spoke of a new thing that God would do in the future. Isaiah 43 and verse 19. Behold, I'm doing a new thing. Now it springs forth. Did you not perceive it? I'll make a way in the wilderness and rivers in the desert. The wild beasts will honor me, and the jackals and the ostriches. I will give water in the wilderness, rivers in the desert, to give drink to my chosen people, the people who I formed for myself, so that they will declare my praise. You see, God had already done what Jesus is now doing, but Jesus is now starting with a new ecclesia, a new group of people based on a new rock, because the old ecclesia, the old people based on Abraham and Sarah as their rock, failed to do what God wanted them to do. They remained adulterous, they remained stiff-necked and hard-hearted, they remained rebellious. This Israel, the Son of God, which was Israel, the apple of His eye, fell into depravity and idolatry and immorality, and it lasts all the way up to the time of Jesus. And so in Isaiah, God says, okay then, I've got to bring a new servant because Israel has failed at what they were called to do. So Isaiah prophesies that in the future, God would raise up a new servant. The new servant would be called Israel. God says, I'm going to do a new thing in Isaiah 43. I didn't give you these, but Isaiah 49 should follow that. And Isaiah 49 is beautiful when you know what it talks about. Isaiah 49 is what says, so I'm going to raise up a new servant. Isaiah 49 says, I will call him my Israel. Isaiah 49 says, and he will gather for me a people from the ends of the earth. And so what Jesus is beginning with Peter is the fulfillment of those Isaiah prophecies. A new servant, a new Israel, and a new people for God. A new people. Just quickly, Galatians chapter 3 describes this new people. Galatians 3 and verse 27. all of you who were baptized into Christ have clothed yourself with Christ. There is neither Jew nor Greek, nor slave, nor free, nor male, nor female. You are all one in Christ Jesus. If you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's seed, and you are the heirs, according to the promise. The new ecclesia, people who are in Christ, replaces the old ecclesia. I also want to just take a moment to talk about the things that Peter confessed and to suggest to you that really when we get to where we are in Matthew 16 and Jesus says, basically stop the press. Peter, you just confessed that I'm the Messiah. You get it. Peter, you nailed it. This has been revealed to you from God. All of that has already happened much earlier in the text. People have already confessed Jesus as the Messiah. People have already confessed Jesus as the Son of God. All of this has already happened. So we might take inventory of that and go, okay, so really, this is about the timing. Jesus saying, stop the press. Peter, what you just said. It's not so much about what he said because other people have already said it. It's more about the timing in Jesus' ministry where Jesus is saying, this is it. This is the beginning. This is the start. I'll just remind you in John 1:1, when Andrew goes to find Peter, his brother, he tells Peter, we found the Messiah. He's already confessed Christ as the Messiah. In Matthew 14, when everybody was in the boat and Jesus stilled the storm, the disciples in the boat says, truly he's the Son of God. So all of these realizations about Jesus have already happened, and Jesus didn't say, stop the press, whoa, you got it. But he is doing that now. So what I want to suggest to you is that where we are at in Matthew 16 is the right time for Jesus to say, stop the press. This is it. This is the beginning. This was the right time. Let me paint the background as to why this is the right time. Jesus had already sent the disciples to the lost tribes of Israel throughout Galilee. They've already done that. After that, when they come back, now Jesus begins sending out his disciples to the Gentiles. First he said, don't go to the Gentiles, but now he's already sent them to the Gentiles. He takes them to Tyre and Sidon, pagan Gentile place. After that, he comes back and he takes them to the Decapolis, a pagan Gentile place. And now he takes them to the northernmost bound, this hideous place called Pan or Bania or Caesarea Philippi, which is the Roman name for it, this ungodly pagan place. So now the ministry has gone out to the Gentiles and Jesus has taught his disciples, these people are included in my plan. So now it's at this point that Jesus can now say, I'm going to build for me a new ecclesia, a new group of people, and it's going to be made up of all of these people that I've taken you towards. This just happens to be the right time to say, I'm starting it, I'm building it, because what happens next in Matthew is Jesus is going to go to Jerusalem and he's going to die and he's preparing his disciples. This is the end. So this happens to be about timing. Just quickly, the last bit of verse 18, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. Again, there's a term here that I want to define for you because this is an incorrect translation. The gates of hell, the word there is Hades. Hades in the Greek is the same as the word Sheol in the Hebrew. Now, the King James Bible does this all over the place. Anytime the scripture says Hades, Sheol, Gehenna, the King James just translates it hell. And I want you to understand the difference between Hades and hell. Hell doesn't exist yet. Hades and Sheol in the Greek and Jewish mind is this place where dead people go. Hades is used a lot in mythology, and the idea is that Hades is somewhere underground. Hades is like a prison, and when people die, that's where they go. They go to this place where dead people are, and the understanding at the time was that Hades had a gate. Hades was a place that nobody ever comes back from. Because once you go through the gates of Hades and you're in the underworld, the gate is locked and you're never allowed to come back out. We get an idea of that when David prophesies what Jesus will feel when he says, "You will not abandon my soul to Sheol. You won't leave me in Hades." It's important to understand that that was the understanding of that place. Once someone dies and goes down there, they never come back from that place. And the Jesus story is that Jesus has a victory over the gates of hell. Hades. What's the difference? Hell is something that happens at the end. Hell is a place that God has prepared for the devil and his angels. It's a special place that nobody is there yet, but God has prepared it for the devil and his angels. And in Revelation, at the end of judgment, at the end of time, that's the eternal place where people are thrown into that place, hell. But right now, the dead are in Hades, just this waiting place. Okay? And so the concept, the gates of hell, is misleading. It should be the gates of Hades will not prevail, which means death will not stop me from building up this new ecclesia. Let me read a couple quotes to you. The primary purpose of the gates of Hades is to keep the dead from escaping. Ancient texts often describe the gates as being locked, Revelation 1:18, evidently to prevent the dead from returning back to life. A little later on, the same commentator says, as these gates seem to swallow up the church, it more likely refers to the disciples of Jesus breaking out of Hades at the time of their resurrection. Jesus has already warned his disciples that they will die. He is now promising that their death will not be permanent. He's already told the church, he's already told this new ecclesia, you're going to be persecuted and killed. And what this phrase is saying, but the gates of Hades will not be able to hold you. You're not going to stay buried. You're not going to stay in Sheol. You're not going to be abandoned there, because there will come a time when God will resurrect his ecclesia, bring them out of Hades into a new and eternal glory. Let me just give you one verse of victory and triumph that focuses on that message. Acts chapter 2 and verse 24. Peter, in his wonderful sermon here, talks about Jesus having had to die, Jesus having entered into that place called Hades for 3 days. And he says, but Hades could not hold him. Hades could not contain him, because he broke out of there and resurrected after 3 days. So Acts chapter 2 and verse 24, God raised him up, loosing the pangs of death, because it was not possible for him to be held by it. The gates of Hades will not prevail, even though they kill you. That will not stop my ecclesia, my people, Because hell, did I say hell? Hades, the gates of death, will not prevail, because one day I will resurrect you. I will bring you out of Hades to live an eternal, glorious life as my new ecclesia, my new assembly. Nothing is going to come between you and me, not even death. That's verse 18. Let's just put a pin right there, guys. And next week we will look at a new authority, which is revealed to us in verse 19.